The cop thought she could humiliate a black man in uniform without consequence, a fleeting power trip fueled by prejudice, until the general made one call that brought the Pentagon to his doorstep, not with thunderous anger, but with the quiet, unwavering force of the United States military. It was supposed to be a brief pause, a momentary recalibration in the middle of a long drive. General Carlton DeHaze had navigated the familiar stretch of Highway 280 between Albany and Americus, Georgia, countless times. The curves were etched in his memory, the endless swathes of trees a comforting green blur, the occasional small-town gas station a testament to time standing still. He knew the landscape like the back of his hand, but today technology had betrayed him. His GPS, normally a reliable beacon, had gone rogue after a recent update, leaving him disoriented and frustrated. Spotting a gravel pull-off just past a weathered green sign that declared Ellerville 4MI, he cautiously slowed down and brought his car to a gentle halt. He shifted the car into park and tapped at his phone screen, the device itself a fortress of technology, military-grade, encrypted. The kind of device that would instantly shut down completely if even the slightest attempt was made to tamper with it. He was dressed inconspicuously in a plain polo shirt and slacks, his rank deliberately concealed. His jacket, bearing the insignia meticulously stitched above the breast pocket, lay neatly folded on the back seat, a silent promise of authority he didn't anticipate needing. 2 minutes, that's all he needed, just a brief moment to regain his bearings. But the sudden crunch of gravel behind him made his head snap up, his senses instantly alert. The rearview mirror revealed the unmistakable image of a cop car, its lights already spinning a silent warning, though no siren had yet pierced the air. It was a beat-up cruiser with faded lettering proclaiming it belonged to the Lee County Sheriff's Department. The driver's door swung open with a decisive thud. A tall woman with blonde hair tightly tucked into a bun emerged, her eyes hidden behind mirrored aviator sunglasses, one hand casually resting on her holstered sidearm. There was no slow, cautious approach, no polite "good afternoon," no request for "license and registration, sir." Instead, she marched directly to the driver's side of his car and rapped sharply on the window. Tap, 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 each tap a deliberate assertion of power. Carlton lowered the window halfway, his expression neutral. "Afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" She snapped, her tone already confrontational. "You're pulled over illegally." "What are you doing out here?" He remained calm, his voice even. "Pulled over to check my GPS. I got turned around." She narrowed her eyes, her gaze sweeping past him into the interior of the car, searching for something. "Where you headed?" He glanced at her name tag, noting the name Wilburn. Her voice was sharp, laced with suspicion. Her tone wasn't curiosity. It was a thinly veiled attempt to exert control. "Just correcting my route," he said calmly, refusing to be intimidated. Wilburn took a step back, slightly widening the distance between them, and deliberately unclipped the holster securing her weapon. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." "For checking my GPS, this is private land, officer. This is a known area for illegal dumping. You fit the profile." The profile. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. She didn't elaborate, just stepped back further and placed her hand fully on the grip of her gun, her knuckles white with tension. Carlton exhaled slowly through his nose, his mind calculating, assessing. He deliberately opened the door and stepped out of the car, his movements measured and non-threatening. He was accustomed to being stared down, challenged, his authority questioned. He had faced down hostile insurgents in Iraq, navigated tense negotiations in Bosnia, and held his ground in countless Washington, D.C. conference rooms filled with people who had never once worn the uniform. But this wasn't protocol, this wasn't proper procedure. This was something else entirely. "I'll step out," he said, his voice even and controlled. "But I want to be clear. I've done nothing wrong." "You're being uncooperative." she retorted, her voice laced with accusation. His brow furrowed slightly. "I've complied with every word you've said." Wilburn motioned him towards the rear of his car. There was no backup in sight, no visible body cam recording her actions. Her radio crackled intermittently, but she ignored it, her focus solely on him. She barked an order. "Place your hands on the trunk." He hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Ma'am, I'm a federal officer," he said, his voice calm but firm. "My ID is inside my vehicle. Please allow me to retrieve it." I said, "Hands on the trunk." Her patience had clearly evaporated. She grabbed his arm with surprising force and spun him around, pressing him against the warm metal. She kicked his legs apart, assuming a posture of control. He didn't resist. He didn't raise his voice, but he said something then, softly, almost to himself. "You're making a mistake." But she didn't listen, blinded by her own preconceived notions. From the road, a pickup truck slowed to a crawl. A woman in the passenger seat rolled down her window just enough to discreetly hold up her phone, capturing the unfolding scene. A teenager in the back seat was already filming, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. No one intervened, but they watched, their faces etched with concern, because there was something deeply unsettling about the scene unfolding before them, something in the unnatural silence, in the way the man didn't flinch or argue, in the way the officer seemed more intent on asserting her power than on asking questions or seeking the truth. Wilburn was breathing heavily, not from physical exertion, but from the rush of adrenaline surging through her veins, clouding her judgment. She had no idea who she was dealing with, no inkling of the power she was about to unleash. Not yet. But something was about to shift, the balance of power about to be irrevocably altered, and it would start with a single, simple request. "I'm not going to repeat myself," Officer Wilburn barked, her hand still hovering menacingly near her gun. "You're being detained." Carlton didn't move. He kept his hands firmly planted on the trunk of the car, his demeanor calm, measured, betraying no hint of fear or panic. "Then I respectfully request that you call your supervisor or allow me to retrieve my identification from the vehicle." "You don't make requests right now," she snapped, her face contorted with anger. "You wait." From the corner of his eye, Carlton could see the teenager from the truck, now standing outside the vehicle, his phone still relentlessly recording every detail of the encounter. The kid's father stood beside him, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, watching, his expression unreadable, saying nothing yet. A quiet tension hung in the air, thick and heavy like the humid air rolling off the nearby trees, a palpable sense of unease permeating the atmosphere. "I'm not resisting," Carlton said again, his voice slow and deliberate this time, each word carefully chosen. "But I do need to identify myself. I'm Lieutenant General Carlton Hayes. My identification is in my briefcase inside that car." Wilburn scoffed, her disbelief palpable. "You expect me to believe that?" He let the question hang in the air for a moment, allowing the absurdity of the situation to sink in. "You don't have to believe it, just check, verify it." But she didn't. Instead, she moved slightly to the side, her hand reaching for her radio, and began to speak into it, her voice low and muffled by static and nerves. She used the carefully chosen words, "suspicious male," and possibly "armed." That last phrase made Carlton subtly turn his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm not carrying a weapon." Wilburn glared at him, her expression hardening. "You're military, right? You people usually are." Carlton blinked slowly, his gaze unwavering. "You people?" She ignored his question, her focus snapping back to the radio. She was requesting dispatch to send backup units to County Road 19, indicating a possible situation developing. Carlton didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't escalate. His years of rigorous training had taught him that the most effective way to disarm arrogance and prejudice was simply to allow it to collapse under its own inherent weight, to let the truth speak for itself. He looked past her toward the pickup truck, his gaze meeting that of the driver. The man now had his arms resting on the window frame, his knuckles white from the pressure. His expression had shifted from passive concern to something harder, something more resolute. The bystanders weren't just curious onlookers anymore. They were deeply uncomfortable, witnessing something that felt fundamentally wrong. "You're escalating something that doesn't need to be," Carlton said gently, his voice a low murmur. "You don't tell me how to do my job," she snapped, her face flushed with anger. "I'm asking you to do it by the book, by procedure." She stepped closer, invading his personal space, her eyes blazing with defiance. "Are you threatening me?" His eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze intense. "No, ma'am, I'm advising you, officer." Wilburn's lips curled for a fraction of a second, as if she found his calm demeanor amusing. Then she swiftly reached for his wallet, still nestled in his back pocket, and yanked it out with unnecessary force. She flipped through it quickly, glancing at each card without truly reading it, her impatience growing with each passing second. Then suddenly she froze, her eyes fixed on one particular item. There, tucked discreetly behind a department ID card, was a Pentagon-issued security clearance card. Level 4. She didn't say anything for a long moment, her mind struggling to process the implications of what she was seeing, but Carlton saw her jaw tighten, saw the flicker of doubt cross her face. "Where'd you get this?" she muttered, her voice barely audible. "I earned it over 30 years of service to this country." She closed the wallet and took a step back, but not far enough to be obvious, not far enough to acknowledge her error. "You could have just said that in the first place." "I did." Her face flushed crimson, but not from the sun or the heat. "You still can't park here," she said, grasping for any semblance of control, any flimsy reason to hold her ground. "I wasn't parked. I was pulled over adjusting my route. My GPS malfunctioned." She turned away as if suddenly remembering her patrol car, and Carlton could see her mentally weighing all the factors involved, how this encounter looked, what the footage might reveal, and what it might conveniently omit. "You'll need to wait here for the responding deputy," she said, her voice tight. "Fine, but once he arrives, I'd like to make a phone call." She turned back to him, her expression skeptical. "You calling your lawyer?" "No," Carlton said, his voice calm and steady. "I'm calling the Department of Defense." She stared at him, searching for a smirk, a punchline, some indication that he was joking. There wasn't one. She opened her mouth to reply, but no words came out, her confidence faltering. In the distance, a faint siren began to wail, the sound of another unit finally responding to her call for backup, but it was still at least 10 minutes away, and in those 10 minutes everything was going to change, because this wasn't going to be a quiet story, easily dismissed or swept under the rug. Too many people were already watching, their eyes and their cameras recording every detail. The sirens were closer now, their echoes bouncing off the trees in short staccato bursts. But Officer Wilburn wasn't waiting, her carefully constructed facade of authority beginning to crumble before his very eyes. Her grip on control was slipping, and she knew it, and Carlton could see it in her frantic pacing, the way she nervously checked over her shoulder at the growing group of onlookers near the roadside. 3 cars now, all pulled over, their occupants silently observing the unfolding drama. Nobody was talking, but everyone was filming. She wasn't thinking like a police officer anymore. She was reacting like someone who felt cornered, trapped by her own actions. "Turn around," she ordered, her voice tight with desperation. Carlton didn't move, his body remaining still. "I've already identified myself, officer." "You're still interfering with a lawful investigation." "I'm not interfering," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm standing here unarmed and cooperating fully with your instructions." She reached out, grabbed his wrist with surprising force and twisted it sharply. "You're resisting arrest!" He clenched his jaw, but he didn't fight back. "This is completely unnecessary." But it didn't matter. She pulled his arm behind his back and slammed the handcuffs on tight, the metal digging into his wrist, the pain sharp and immediate. Gasps of shock and outrage echoed from the roadside, a chorus of disapproval directed at her actions. The teenager had moved even closer, his camera phone held steady, recording everything. He whispered something to his father, who didn't answer, but raised his own phone to start filming as well, ensuring that every moment of this injustice was captured for posterity. "Everything's being recorded," Carlton said, his voice low, not a threat, simply a statement of fact, a reminder that her actions were not occurring in a vacuum. "You think that matters?" Wilburn hissed, her voice laced with a mixture of defiance and desperation. "It always does, officer!" "Sooner or later, the truth always comes out." She pushed him forward, forcing him toward her patrol car, her grip on his arm unyielding. The gravel underfoot crunched and shifted, but Carlton didn't stumble, didn't resist, his movements controlled and deliberate. But she was rough, her actions fueled by a desperate need to regain control, and he could feel it, not just in her grip, but in her voice, in the palpable tension radiating from her body. She was trying to prove something, maybe to herself, maybe to the onlookers, maybe to some unseen audience. She opened the back door of the cruiser and shoved him inside without a word, without a shred of courtesy or respect. No Miranda rights, no explanation of the charges against him, no adherence to even the most basic legal procedures. "You're going to regret this," a voice called out, the words filled with righteous anger. It came from the man with the teenager, the father who had been silently observing the scene. He hadn't moved from his position near the truck, but his voice was steady, his southern accent thick and unwavering, suggesting he was probably somewhere in his mid-40s. Wilburn snapped, her anger flaring. "Mind your own business, sir." "I am," the man said, his voice resonating with conviction. "This is my business now, officer." Wilburn slammed the cruiser door shut with excessive force and stormed to the front of her vehicle, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She leaned inside, fumbling with the radio, but her voice was noticeably shaky now, betraying her mounting panic. Carlton sat in the back of the cruiser, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, breathing slowly and deliberately through his nose, focusing on each second, trying to maintain his composure in the face of this blatant abuse of power. 1, 2, 3, slow and steady, he repeated silently to himself. He didn't know who Wilburn was trying to impress, the dispatcher, the cameras, herself. But it was clear that she was unraveling, her facade of authority crumbling under the weight of her own actions. He could hear it in the barely suppressed panic laced through her words as she described him to the responding units, her narrative carefully crafted to paint him as a threat. She still hadn't bothered to check his credentials fully, hadn't verified the Pentagon contact number, hadn't even noticed the small, almost imperceptible seal stitched into the collar of the jacket lying on the back seat, the detail that would have instantly revealed his true identity and the magnitude of her mistake. But someone else had noticed. The teenager walked to the edge of the road and zoomed in with his phone camera, capturing a close-up view of the jacket. "It says U.S. Army on the jacket," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "You got that?" his dad asked, his voice filled with quiet satisfaction. "Yeah, the badge, the stars, everything." A second siren joined the first, its wail growing louder as the responding units drew nearer. Carlton looked out the window, his gaze unwavering. 2 more patrol cars pulled up behind Wilburn's, one from the county sheriff's office, the other from the state patrol, their flashing lights adding to the chaotic scene. Out stepped Deputy Lamar Boyd, a tall man with a salt-and-pepper beard and a heavy build, his demeanor calm and measured. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't rush towards the scene. Instead, he walked slowly and deliberately towards Wilburn, who met him halfway. her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her posture tense and defensive. Carlton couldn't hear their exchange, but he could see Wilburn's hands flying in the air as she frantically explained her version of the events. Boyd tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable, then glanced towards the patrol car, his gaze meeting Carlton's through the tinted window. He approached the vehicle slowly and deliberately and opened the back door. "Sir, I need to ask your name." Carlton looked up at the deputy, his eyes calm and steady. "Lieutenant General Carlton Hayes, United States Army." Boyd blinked once, betraying his surprise at the revelation. "Did she see your ID, sir?" She had it in her hand. Boyd nodded once, acknowledging the information, and shut the door without saying another word. He turned to Wilburn, his expression now stern. They moved off to the side, their voices low and hushed, Wilburn's posture shifting, becoming even more stiff and defensive. Boyd looked towards the growing crowd of onlookers, then back at her, his gaze filled with concern. A few seconds later, Boyd returned to the patrol car and opened the back door again. "Sir," he said, his voice respectful, "is there anyone you'd like to call? Anyone we can contact for you?" Carlton nodded, accepting the offer without hesitation. "Yes, one person." Boyd reached into his pocket, pulled out his own personal cell phone, and handed it over to Carlton without hesitation, recognizing that this was no longer just about correcting a mistake. It was about accountability, about upholding the principles of justice and fairness. Carlton sat in the back seat of the patrol car, still cuffed, holding Deputy Boyd's phone awkwardly in both hands, his fingers surprisingly steady despite the circumstances. The handcuffs didn't make it easy, but he knew the number by heart, the digits etched into his memory. There were only 3 people in the entire Department of Defense whom he ever called directly, only 3 individuals who possessed the authority and the resources to address a situation of this magnitude. This particular number was a direct line to someone who had personally cleared his covert missions across 4 continents, someone who possessed unwavering loyalty and unquestioning trust. The phone rang once, twice, then a familiar voice answered on the other end, the voice calm and professional. "Major Kendall speaking. This is General Carlton Hayes. I'm being unlawfully detained by local law enforcement in Schley County, Georgia. I'm in the back of a patrol car, hands cuffed. I need verification sent immediately." There was a brief pause on the line, a moment of stunned silence. Then, "General Hayes, are you secure for the moment, sir?" "Relatively secure. I need them to verify my ID and my credentials. There are multiple bystanders recording this encounter. Officer Wilburn failed to follow protocol from the outset. I'm concerned that this situation may escalate further." "Understood, General. Stay on the line, sir. I'm alerting the Pentagon liaison to DHS and contacting military police." There was a click on the line, indicating a call transfer. A new voice came through, calm and authoritative. "This is Commander Reeves, sir. We're tracking your coordinates now. I have your military vehicle registration pulled up and confirmed. Local authorities will be receiving direct contact from us in under 10 minutes, sir." Carlton exhaled slowly, his body relaxing slightly. "Thank you, Commander Reeves. Please expedite the process, and thank you for keeping calm in this situation." "We will, sir. Stand by, and thank you for your service." Carlton ended the call and handed the phone back to Deputy Boyd, his expression unreadable. Through the open car door, Boyd took the phone, glanced at Wilburn, who was still hovering near her patrol car, her face pale and drawn, and walked away to make a call of his own. Carlton heard snippets of the conversation as Boyd spoke into his radio, his voice calm but firm. "Yes, sir." "That's exactly what he said, sir. Confirmed by the Pentagon. Understood, sir. I'll stand by and await further instructions." Carlton leaned back against the seat, watching the scene unfold through the window, his mind racing. Wilburn hadn't come any closer, hadn't attempted to apologize or explain her actions. Her expression was rigid, her eyes darting nervously between the phone screens aimed her way and the man sitting quietly in the back seat of the patrol car, the man she had so carelessly dismissed. 5 minutes passed, the silence punctuated only by the distant wail of sirens and the occasional murmur of voices. Then, the sound of new tires crunching on the gravel filled the air, but these weren't the sounds of local patrol cars. 3 black SUVs, their windows tinted darker than legal, pulled up, moving with an authority that demanded attention. No markings adorned the vehicles, but they were unmistakably federal, the kind of cars that moved as if they had the inherent right of way everywhere. One SUV stopped just ahead of the line of patrol cars, effectively blocking the highway. The second SUV parked directly behind Wilburn's cruiser, boxing her in. The doors of the SUVs opened in perfect sequence, revealing a team of individuals who exuded an air of quiet competence and unwavering determination. 2 men in dark suits, their earpieces barely visible, stepped out of the lead vehicle. A third individual, dressed in a full army dress uniform, complete with medals and ribbons, emerged from the same vehicle. It was Colonel Errol Gaines, a name that was well known and respected within military circles, but one that Wilburn had likely never heard before. He walked directly past Boyd, ignoring Wilburn completely, and approached the patrol car, opening the back door himself. "Sir," Gaines said, his voice calm but firm. "Are you all right, General?" Carlton nodded, his expression betraying no emotion. "I'm fine, Colonel. Just a bruised sense of pride, nothing more. You can take it from here." Gaines turned to Boyd, his gaze unwavering. "Who's in charge of this situation?" Boyd hesitated for a moment, lifting a hand slightly, but his face clearly indicated that he wasn't happy about any of this. "I've only been on the scene for 10 minutes. That officer," he motioned towards Wilburn with a nod of his head, "initiated the traffic stop." Gaines walked over to Wilburn, his gaze unwavering, his presence radiating an aura of quiet power. Wilburn finally stiffened her spine and attempted to compose herself, but her efforts were futile. "Do you know who that man is?" he asked her plainly, his voice filled with disbelief. She squared her shoulders, attempting to regain some semblance of control. "He didn't provide proper identification until after I had placed him in handcuffs. I was acting on reasonable suspicion. He refused to comply with my lawful orders. He gave you his name. He gave you his title. You held his federal identification card in your hand. That's a 3-star general you unlawfully detained and locked in the back of a patrol car, officer." Wilburn tried to speak again, to offer some justification for her actions, but her voice caught in her throat. The full weight of her actions was finally sinking in, crushing her beneath its immensity. "I suggest you don't say another word," Gaines added, his voice dangerously soft. "This incident is being reported to your department, to your sheriff, and to the state attorney general. Be prepared to face the consequences of your actions." Wilburn's mouth opened, then closed, no sound emerging. Deputy Boyd quietly stepped to the side and spoke into his radio, requesting dispatch to bring the county sheriff to the scene. He didn't even bother to look at Wilburn, his actions speaking volumes about his opinion of her conduct. Carlton stepped out of the patrol car on his own, his movements deliberate and controlled. His wrists were red, the skin slightly torn and chafed from the pressure of the handcuffs, but he didn't complain, didn't even rub them. A few of the bystanders had moved closer, their faces etched with concern, staying silent, unsure of what was going to happen next. "Sir," Colonel Gaines said to him, his voice respectful, "would you like to press charges against Officer Wilburn?" Carlton looked at Wilburn, his expression unreadable, then at the growing crowd of onlookers behind her, their cell phones still recording every detail of the scene. He turned back to Gaines, his voice steady and calm. "Not yet, Colonel. I want her held accountable through the proper channels. I want the public to see what happened here. because some lessons don't need shouting, they just need to be seen, observed, and understood. The crowd had thickened, words spreading quickly, first through whispers between passing cars, then through social media, the viral nature of the internet amplifying the impact of the events. The videos, raw and unedited, were already making the rounds online before the sun began to dip low in the sky, their impact undeniable. The hashtags weren't subtle, their message clear. General Hayes, #Schley County, #profiling on camera. News vans began to line the shoulder of Highway 280 by noon the following day. Their satellite dishes pointed towards the sky, as if the location were some kind of major crime scene. Except no crime had occurred, at least not by the man who had been unjustly placed in handcuffs. General Hayes had quietly left the scene the night before, choosing not to speak publicly, preferring to let his actions speak for him. No press conference, no angry interview, just a short, private phone call to his wife, followed by a long, quiet drive back to Fort Benning. He never raised his voice, never called for protests or boycotts, never sought to inflame the situation, and that, in its own way, made the story even more powerful, even more impactful. The sheriff's office released a statement, clean, sterile, and carefully worded, stripped of any real meaning. "We are aware of the incident involving Officer Tracy Wilburn and an unidentified motorist on Highway 280. The matter is currently under internal investigation." They conveniently left out the fact that the unidentified motorist had more command experience than their entire department combined, and that he was a highly decorated 3-star general. But the people knew, the public saw the truth, and their outrage was palpable. By the second day, protests began forming outside the sheriff's office, not thousands of people, but enough to rattle the windows and make their voices heard, enough to warrant coverage on every local news station across the state of Georgia. Veterans stood out front, proudly holding photos of General Hayes, Hayes in uniform, Hayes in the field, Hayes at the White House, being handed a medal by the president. The weight of the situation started pressing down on every name that was tied to Schley County, the reputation of the community tarnished by the actions of one individual. Reporters began digging into Wilburn's past, uncovering a disturbing pattern of behavior. They found evidence of previous complaints, 3 formal grievances filed against her in the past 2 years, all dismissed quietly, 2 involving black drivers, 1 involving a single mother who claimed that Wilburn had followed her home and issued her a ticket for improper attitude. All of it came roaring back to the surface, fueling the public outrage. Wilburn remained silent, refusing to comment on the situation. Her lawyer issued a generic denial. "My client acted in accordance with her training and did not violate any established procedures." But there was no training that could justify what the public had witnessed. No procedures that explained cuffing a man without cause after being presented with valid federal identification. Meanwhile, General Hayes maintained his stoic silence, keeping his head down and focusing on his duties. He didn't seek out interviews, didn't post statements on social media, didn't attempt to capitalize on the situation in any way. His only public comment came during a small veterans forum in Columbus, Georgia, 3 days later. The event wasn't even supposed to be covered by the media, but someone from the crowd surreptitiously recorded his remarks anyway. He stood at a wooden podium in a small church hall, wearing his full dress uniform, his hands folded in front of him, his expression calm but serious. "I've faced hostility on foreign soil, serving my country in dangerous and unpredictable situations. I've worked under administrations that didn't necessarily want me in the room, my presence tolerated but not always welcomed. But I've never been made to feel smaller, never felt more marginalized than I did on that Georgia roadside," he said, his voice filled with quiet emotion. Then he paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "But I won't carry anger in my heart. That's not what this country needs. What we need is accountability, yes, but more importantly, we need honesty. We can't fix what we pretend doesn't exist. We can't heal what we refuse to acknowledge. The room stood up in complete silence. Not applause, just a quiet collective acknowledgement of the truth that he had spoken, a shared understanding of the injustice he had endured. 2 days after that, Sheriff Roger Nix announced that the internal investigation into the incident had been concluded. Tracy Wilburn was terminated from her position with the Schley County Sheriff's Department. The county cited excessive use of force, failure to follow established protocol, and blatant misuse of authority as the official reasons for her dismissal. But behind closed doors, Sheriff Nix said something different, something more honest to his staff. He said, "She got caught doing something we all knew she'd been doing for a long time, and that's the part that should shame us. Not just what she did, but that we let it go on for so long." Her termination didn't completely silence the noise, didn't erase the pain, but it did change something fundamental. Schools began hosting discussions on respect, power, and the importance of holding law enforcement accountable. Local newspapers ran editorials focusing not just on racism, but on the dangers of blind obedience to authority and the importance of questioning unjust orders. And the Reardon family, the ones who had bravely filmed the incident, were invited to Washington to be recognized for their act of civic courage, their willingness to stand up for what was right. As for Carlton Hayes, he returned to Fort Benning and quietly resumed his duties, his focus on leading and mentoring the next generation of soldiers. But the next time he addressed new cadets, he told them one thing: "You wear this uniform with honor, representing the best this country has to offer. But some people, fueled by ignorance and prejudice, will still see what they want to see, projecting their biases onto you. Don't ever let that stop you from standing tall. Don't ever let it diminish your commitment to service. Because sometimes justice isn't loud, it isn't flashy, it's steady, it's persistent, and it never forgets." 3 weeks later, the initial storm of outrage had subsided. The news cycle had moved on, but the story hadn't faded completely from the public consciousness. It came up in college classrooms, in small-town barbershops, in Sunday sermons, sparking conversations about race, power, and the enduring challenges of equality. People weren't just talking about what happened on Highway 280, they were asking why it keeps happening, why a man could serve his country with honor for over 30 years, commanding thousands of soldiers, leading troops into battle, and still be mistaken for a threat simply because of what someone thought they saw, because of the color of his skin. General Hayes never leaned into victimhood. That wasn't in his nature, wasn't who he was as a man. But he also didn't pretend like it hadn't happened, didn't dismiss the incident as an isolated event. He believed in transparency, in quiet dignity, in leading by presence, not volume. He declined several lucrative offers for televised interviews, refusing to turn his pain into entertainment. But he did accept an invitation to speak at a leadership conference in Tallahassee, Florida. The auditorium wasn't full of generals or members of the press. It was filled with teachers, first responders, and high school students, everyday people who were eager to learn from his experience. He stepped up to the microphone, wearing a simple dark suit, no medals, no stars, his appearance deliberately understated. "I want to talk about restraint," he began, his voice low but resonating with power. Not silence, not passivity, but real restraint, the kind that requires inner strength, because when you're wronged, when you're publicly humiliated, everything in you wants to lash out, to strike back, to seek revenge. But power isn't measured by how hard you hit, it's measured by how much you choose not to, by how much you choose to control your anger and channel it into something positive. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. You can't control how people see you, what biases they bring to their interactions with you, but you can control how you respond when they get it wrong. And that choice, that power of self-control, that's where real strength lives. That's where true leadership begins. Someone in the front row, a young female EMT, raised her hand. "How did you stay so calm that day, sir? I don't think I could have done that." He smiled faintly, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Because my life wasn't defined by that single moment. It was defined by everything that came before it, by the experiences that shaped me, by the values I had learned. That officer didn't know my story, didn't understand my sacrifices, but I did, and that was enough." Later, someone asked him if he was angry about what had happened. "Yes," he answered honestly, "but I don't carry it. I use it. Anger, when carried, festers, weighs you down, consumes you. But when you use it right, when you channel it into action, it makes you sharper, it makes you more determined, it makes you speak up when it counts." Back in Schley County, things had begun to shift, slowly but surely. A new training requirement was implemented for every officer in the department, focused not just on policy and procedure, but on perception, on implicit bias, and on the importance of treating every individual with respect and dignity, regardless of their race, background, or perceived social status. Deputies were required to take implicit bias training courses, not as a form of punishment, but as a corrective measure, a way to help them recognize and address their own unconscious prejudices. Sheriff Nix, despite his own flaws and shortcomings, made the courageous decision to bring in independent consultants, people who had never worn a badge, but had lived through the experience of being unfairly profiled, bringing a fresh perspective to the department. Community panels were formed, creating a space for open and honest conversations between law enforcement and the citizens they served. The discussions weren't easy, emotions ran high, but they were necessary, a crucial step towards building trust and understanding. Tracy Wilburn quietly disappeared from the headlines, fading into obscurity. She moved 2 counties over, and according to one unconfirmed source, she found a job in private security, no longer wielding the power of a badge or the threat of a firearm, just wearing a simple uniform with her name stitched on the chest, a silent reminder of her past mistakes. As for the Reardon family, they returned home to their regular life, but Miles, the teenager with the camera phone, kept filming, his perspective forever changed by what he had witnessed. He started a YouTube channel where he interviewed veterans, teachers, and neighbors about integrity, justice, and the importance of standing up for what's right. His first video, titled "I Didn't Know Who He Was, But I Knew What Was Wrong," hit 500,000 views in the first week, its message resonating with people across the country. Carlton watched it from his office one evening, quietly reflecting on the events of the past few weeks. When the video ended, he clicked off his screen, stood up, and walked outside, drawn to the vastness of the night sky. The air was cool, a welcome respite from the heat of the day, the sky still holding on to that faint orange-pink glow of sunset. He didn't feel proud of what had happened. He didn't feel vindicated. He just felt a quiet sense of certainty that staying calm had made all the difference, that his restraint had ultimately been more powerful than any show of force. In the end, it wasn't the rank on his shoulder, it wasn't the medals on his chest that exposed the injustice. It was how he carried himself in the face of disrespect, how he maintained his dignity and composure while being unjustly treated. And it wasn't a press conference or a carefully crafted speech that moved the needle. It was the quiet power of restraint, the simple act of decency, the undeniable truth filmed on a cell phone and shared by strangers that forced a small corner of the world to see itself differently, to confront its own prejudices and biases. Because sometimes the greatest form of protest isn't marching in the streets or shouting slogans, it's simply standing still while everyone else is watching, refusing to be defined by the negativity of others. If this story moved you, if it made you think twice about how quickly we judge and how easily we make assumptions, take a moment to share it. Speak up when you see injustice, record it if you can, say something when something feels off, because silence in the face of injustice is complicity. And if you believe that more stories like this should be told, stories that challenge our perceptions and inspire us to be better, Subscribe to channels that amplify those voices, support independent journalism, and demand accountability from those in power. Thank you for listening, for caring, and for being a part of the change.